Pokemon Legends EA has us all waiting with so much anticipation. But that's not to say we don't have some fun speculation games ahead of us. One such game being the ever-present question of what starters we could see in the game. I've done some research and would like to share how likely each candidate is based on their affiliation with France and specificity to Paris when it comes to overlap between history, ecology, and lore. Obviously, Generation 6 starters Froakie, Fennekin, and Chespin are discluded from this list, as we already know they'll be available in the game regardless of the starters the game presents us with in the beginning. The starters from Legends Arceus, Oshawott, Cyndaquil, and Rowlet are also exempt, as it's pretty obvious Game Freak won't rehash any of them for their second entry in the same sub-series. All that said, let's dive in, quite literally, starting with our water types. Generation 1 gave us Squirtle, and this little cutie evolves into Blastoise. The evolutionary line has a very simple tie to Paris in that their defining feature is that they're turtles, and turtles inhabit Paris. Blastoise also resembles a tank with his water cannons, and while Paris does have a history of using tanks in combat, it's definitely not something that's ever been specific to Paris or France as a whole. This means Squirtle does stand a chance at being the water starter we see in the game, but with such a simple connection, how does he stack up against the others? Well, let's find out. On first glance, you might look at Totodile, the eccentric water starter from Generation 2, and think he's already disqualified. After all, he's a crocodile Pokemon, and crocodiles don't exist in Paris. They do, however, exist in other areas of France, but what would make this choice of starter truly interesting is the story of the sewer monster from 1984. This occurrence actually sparked a plethora of other urban legends and fiction in the city, but this was the one time something like this actually took place. Yes, in 1984, a 500-pound Nile crocodile who would later come to be named Eleanor was found living in the sewers of Paris. Today, Eleanor actually still resides in the Paris Aquarium and is roughly 40 years old, 8 feet long, and 550 pounds. Now, this is such a cool story that I'm personally Team Totodile for Legends EA, and I absolutely would adore it if he's the water pick for this entry. Beyond the supremely awesome story in Urban Legends, the Totodile for Alligator line would also just be super cool to have a spotlight shined upon for the first time really since Gen 2, and they could really use some sort of alternate form or buff to catch them up in competitive. My personal pick, and a likely one based on history, Totodile is likely to join the roster of Legends EA, albeit less likely than some of the other water starters we have in the pipeline. Huh. See what I did there? Pipeline. Yeah, anyways. Mudkip is the next on our list. I won't spend too much time here as much as I love Mudkip. They and Swampert just don't have any real ties to Paris or France. A mud skipper, a marshland creature, and a swamp monster, there really is no clear connection this evolutionary line has to Lumiose, and for that, Mudkip earns the title of least likely water starter to be seen in Pokemon Legends EA. Piplup, on the other hand, is very likely. Well, I take that back. Piplup isn't, but Empoleon is. Empoleon, as you may have guessed, is influenced very heavily by France's Emperor Napoleon. They even share the same exact height. This is as on the nose as it gets for a reference to France, yet there's still one major factor holding this evolutionary line back from being the choice. Piplup was just included heavily in Generation 8's BDSP and Legends Arceus. With Piplup already having been so central to several recent Pokemon games, I'd say that warrants Game Freak to at least take a look elsewhere and see if someone else might be a fresher choice for the moment. All in all though, Piplup ranks very highly among the possibilities for the water starters in Legends EA, especially when you consider that there are even some species of penguin native to France, specifically in the French Southern Territories. Generation 7 gave us Popplio and Primarina, one of the most unique evolutionary lines in the entire series, a sea lion mermaid hybrid. Primarina holds significance within France as France holds a famous bronze statue of a mermaid off the Promenade de la Marinella. There's also a popular folklore tale of Melizin, a female spirit of fresh water who resembles the appearance of a mermaid in most depictions. You could also argue Primarina shares a connection with Paris with the fact that there's a romantic comedy titled Mermaid in Paris. but that's neither here nor there. An obscure connection we can find on Primarina sea lion side of things, though, is the link sea lions have to performance culture. Sea lions are known for being very talented with juggling balls and very communicative with humans to perform in front of crowds. France has deep ties to circus performances, which leads to an overlap in showmanship interests between the culture of the country and of the mammal. Though she may be an obscure choice, Primarina has some likelihood to be our water starter in Pokemon Legends ZA. Sobble is next on our list, as he's the Galarian starter from Generation 8. With Inteleon as his final evolution, there's lots of room to play around with concepts and bring this evolutionary line closer in line with the history of Paris. The Sobble line are lizards, and Inteleon personifies a secret agent. While secret agent spies don't necessarily have direct ties to France in history or entertainment, they are heavily referenced to be European in a lot of movies and television. However, I don't think this brings Inteleon too close to taking the water starter spot for Legends ZA. Quaxley, on the other hand, is a bit more likely. Paris hosts ducks, and the final evolution Quaquaval is a dancer. Currently, they embody more Spanish dance styles, but we could see a version of Quaquaval that takes more inspiration from French styles. An average likelihood among the starters we've talked about, and certainly one of the more interesting ones if added to Legends ZA. There you have Quaxley and Quaquaval. So let's recap so far. Our least likely candidate is Mudkip, no shared history with Paris whatsoever. The next likely is Sobble, as he doesn't have any significant ties to Paris. Ahead of Sobble comes Quaxley. While it certainly would be an interesting pick, the Parisian ties are shallow, and we just had Quaxley as a starter literally the last game we played, diminishing its chances a good bit. Next I'd say is Squirtle, as the connections this evolutionary line shares with Paris are very light, and Gen 1 has been overplayed in the past, especially since all Gen 1 starters had been obtainable in X and Y as well. Though the opposite could be true, and Game Freak might want to pander to Gen 1 again for X and Y fans, setting Squirtle's chances a bit higher than Quaxley. More likely than Squirtle would be Totodile. Once again, the history of the croc in the sewers is so cool and legendary amongst Parisians. Sure, the date of when that happened in real life would certainly be after the time period of Legends ZA, assuming it does take place in the past. But who cares? It's a fictional version of the world. If you ask me, this one is too cool to pass up, and I really hope they don't pass it up. Plus, a new form of Feraligatr and even some buffs to him in general would be very loved by fans. Next likely is Primarina. She shares some awesome history and culture with Paris, has some options in getting a new form for the new setting, such as possibly having a reptilian lower half to reference other depictions of Melazin. And she's just plain cool and has been underutilized in general, making her a fresh pick for a starter in Pokemon Legends ZA. Finally, we have the most likely candidate for the water starter in a vacuum, and that is Piplup. Empoleon just shares such strong ties to French history, and the time periods are far closer if the game does take place in the past. The only thing going against Piplup's odds are how centralized they were in Generation 8 recently, but otherwise the shoe fits no one else better. Now, we are going to have to loop back around to these water starters one more time later, as generational picks for Grass and Fire may disqualify some of these top choices, especially those at the top. So let's move on to grass starters before we eventually come back for rounding up all the starters of each type later. Generation 1 gave us the Bulbasaur line, part dinosaur, part plant, part frog. This evolutionary line doesn't have any connections to Paris aside from frogs living there in real life. A weak connection, but a connection nonetheless. Next we have Chikorita from Generation 2, also part dinosaur, part plant, but no frog aspect. Chikorita finds herself even less likely to be in Legends ZA as she shares zero ties with French history. The only possible link I can think of is that the entire line has neck flowers, which could be given a new final form to resemble more of a royalties necklace or something. Otherwise, I see nothing that gives Chikorita a chance here. Generation 3 gave us Trico and Sceptile, a wood gecko line that resides primarily within forests. I don't really see any meaningful link between them and France, so I labeled them as fairly unlikely as well. And same with Turtwig and Torterra from Generation 4. Not only were their starters already over-centralized in Generation 8 recently, but they share no meaningful ties with Paris and France as a whole. Wow, we really just blew through all those grass starters, didn't we? But let's slow down a bit to talk about Generation 5's Snivy line. Snivy is a grass snake Pokemon, while France hosts two native species of grass snakes. Furthermore, Superior, the final evolution of Snivy, is heavily inspired by real-life queens, as she's known as the regal Pokemon. Superior, as she stands right now, is fairly generic in her royal design, not referencing any one queen in particular. But we could see a brand new form for her that gives her a closer resemblance to French royalty. I already love Superior a lot, and honestly, this is one of the few cases of the starters that we're looking at that are both my personal hope and an extremely likely pick to be chosen. Generation 8 gave us Grookey and Rillaboom. A tree monkey and Rillaboom personifying a street performer, there are definitely connections to be made between this evolutionary line and the history of Paris. Rillaboom could even get a new form that gives him instruments that are more appropriate for the time period and locale of old-timey Paris, though I suppose drums would still fit no matter what. Regardless of that though, ecologically Grookey doesn't make sense since there's no species of monkey or chimp native to France. Finally, we have Sprigatito and Mouscarada from Gen 9. These darling cats would easily fit into the urban aesthetic of Lumiose in Legend ZA, but they are slightly held back by the fact that we just had them as starters in the previous game, Scarlet and Violet. It would be cool to see a new form of Mouscarada though. All in all, I don't even think I need to go over each grass-type starter again as most of them are just plain disqualified, but Superior, Meowscarada, and Rillaboom have by far the biggest chances, with Superior inching out ever so slightly thanks to her sharing more connections to the ecology and history of Paris. So let's take a look now at the fire starters. Charmander is our Generation 1 rep, and once again is a Pokemon that we gained access to within the confines of X and Y back in the day. However, Charmander and Charizard generally don't make much sense in the context of Paris, as they're volcanic reptile Pokemon. They are extremely unlikely to be in Legend ZA. Torchic, on the other hand, seems very likely. The national bird of France is a rooster, which the Torchic line does kind of resemble. Blaziken's appearance is also highly malleable for a new form that could make him resemble historic figures of France and specifically Paris. The ecological tie is deep, while the historic one is fairly loose, but all being said, Torchic is definitely a possibility to be the fire starter in Pokemon Legends ZA. Chimchar is, just like his Gen 4 counterparts, held back by being centralized recently with 2 Pokemon entries. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, chimps are not native to France. The only thing this line has going for it is Infernape kind of resembles royalty, and a new form could take that even further. But with how many other likely candidates we have for the fire starter, I'm just not buying it. Such as Tepig. This little cutie is a boar, which are native to France, and beyond just resembling royalty, the final evolution Embror personifies royalty. This gives Tepig both ecological and historical ties to France, making them one of the most likely candidates yet. Generation 7 brought us the Litten line. Once again, a street cat. Litten would fit in perfectly with the urban aesthetic of Lumiose. If that wasn't enough, the final evolution of Incineroar embodies a wrestler's persona, rounding out the urban influence entirely. This connection to France goes extremely deep when you consider wrestling has a long-standing history in the country. Incineroar gets 3 points, one for ecology, one for history, and a third for a cool story. Plus, if the royalty thing is touched on by either the water starter or the grass starter, having a wrestler be the final variation of personas could be very welcome. Even better, if the persona is slightly modified to adopt a different or related fighting style to fit even closer to the setting of Paris a la Lumiose. Let's not forget Cinderace though. Similar to the Litten line, the Scorbunny line is also extremely urban in nature. Maybe not by their rabbit half, as that's more rural, but in the football playing persona that the entire line shares, the link is insanely strong. Football, or what Americans call soccer, is the most popular sport in all of Paris. This boosts Scorbunny's chances of being the fire starter immensely. Finally, we have Fuecoco and Skeledirge. Similarly to Totodile, this line could theoretically embody the story of the sewer monster. On one hand, Skeledirge fits it a little better, as the final form is on all fours and remains a crocodile instead of becoming an alligator. On the other hand, Fuecoco, both in name and design, throughout all 3 forms, is very much Spanish as opposed to French. And it's not like Feraligator's new form in Legend ZA couldn't be made to closer resemble a crocodile or even just be down on all fours. Regardless, there's no denying how likely this Pokemon is. The singing personification also helps, as music is of course culturally sound in France, just as it is in most parts of the world. Skeledirge, much like his other Gen 9 counterparts though, is of course held back by the fact that he was just a starter in the previous Pokemon game. So all that being said, let's look at the possible trios. Let's start with Superior, as out of all the type-based starters, she has the clearest, most defined, and unique spot amongst her grass comrades, and who I believe most confidently overall to be chosen as a starter for a given type. That said, if she's taking the royalty slot and the Gen 5 slot, Tepig is no longer in the running, and neither is Empoleon, meaning we could see a trio like Superior, Totodile, and Cinderace, which would be a very diverse take on the starters with one Regal, one Sportsy, and one monster-like Pokemon in the options list. We could also see Superior, Totodile, and Incineroar, which would be funny, since that would have the same generations represented as Legends Arceus. Conversely, we could see something more like Superior, Primarina, and Cinderace. This would give us a royalty slot, a sportsy cultural slot, and a lore-filled miscellaneous slot in the form of Primarina. Honestly, there are many ways we could mix and match the starters though at this point, and heck, if we're not using Superior as a baseline, this could look like a completely different trio. So until we know more, we don't really have any more educated guesses we can make for who we'll have available in Legends EA. But, what do your trio of starters look like? Please comment it down below and let's talk about it. It would also be great if you explained why you chose each Pokemon in the trio that you crafted. Afterwards, feel free to check out more of my videos such as this one here where I discuss why Legends is the best thing to happen to the Pokemon series since Go. I've been johtojonny, and I'll catch you all in the next one.